What are the 9 things you should be doing right now to be ready when cruising is possible again? I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my cruising tips for travelers. I want to share with you things that I'm doing and I think everybody should be doing if you're interested in cruising again, whether that's when the shutdown ends, late in the year, next year, or even further away. Things that you could be doing right now, using your time right now. Perhaps you're still in lockdown and have time on your hands to start preparing to go cruising again. So these are the 9 things that I'm doing and I hope they help you. So I want to start first of all with this one. One of the critical things to do is decide when you actually want to go cruising again. I think there's probably 3 groups of people that I'm seeing. One group of people who are basically holding on to their bookings, a little bit like me, I guess, and are waiting for the day that shutdown ends and they want to head out cruising again. There's another group of people who are saying, look, I think probably later in the year is more realistic. And then those people who are saying, look, I want to wait to 2021 and beyond. So really important, I think, is decide when you want to go cruising, because that will also determine which of these 8 things that I'm going to talk about next you do sooner rather than later. One of the things I would suggest you do, though, as you think about going cruising a little bit later, is broadly think about your wish list. So what are the destinations or the regions or the areas that you want to go? Because as we start going through these points, a lot of the choices that you make on your wish list is going to determine around when you can go cruising, because either the season happens or it doesn't happen. So for example, Alaska season, that really runs normally in most years from sort of May to October. This year, it's been completely thrown out at the moment because certainly ports are closed to July. It may or may not start later in the season. So depending on where you want to go, what is on your wish list, that will determine a little bit how you use these next 8 things I'm going to talk about. The second absolutely critical thing to do is to make sure that you're well briefed and on top of what your particular government's travel restrictions are. So at the time of recording, for example, in the United States, they have, I think, what's called a stage 4 or a category 4 CDC rating, Center for Disease Control, which basically says no travel at all. If I take a look at the UK, which is where I'm based, the government has updated the advisory to say no non-essential travel indefinitely. Now, clearly these things will chop and change, but make sure that you're on top of what your government is saying. So for example, at the time of recording is, people from the EU countries, UK and Ireland, they also can't even go into the US at this point in time. So you really need to understand what are the restrictions, the travel restrictions that are in place. That also determines whether your travel insurance will be valid, because if you travel to a place that's a no travel area, your travel insurance won't cover you. We don't know at this point in time how long those are going to be in place. My gut feeling is that's going to last for quite a long time, and even way past even when sort of more domestic lockdowns are and restrictions are eased. So really important, stay on top of that. You can do that by following your State Department or your Foreign Office. The third thing you need to do is stay on top of what regions and ports are opening or not opening and when they're opening. So for example, at this point in time that I'm recording, you've got Australia closed, all their ports till way towards the end of June. You've got Canada closed until July. You've got New Zealand closed to July. All the sort of ports in Europe are locked down with no open dates yet. So you need to really keep on top of when actually ports and cruise lines are going to start cruising in. So when regions and cruise lines are opening. How do you do that? Well, it could be quite complicated. I'll tell you the way that I do it, and I find these things have worked pretty well for me, keeping on top of the situation. First of all, one of the good things to do is to follow your cruise line that you are thinking of cruising with on Facebook. You can also follow them on other social media like Twitter. What I've found, generally speaking, is their Facebook pages have been very, very active in terms of posting updates or advising you when they're making certain decisions. I found that's actually the best way of keeping on top of things. The second thing that I would do actually on Facebook, there's another couple of groups and pages that I would also recommend you follow, because these are really fantastic at kind of collating all the latest information. One of my favorite ones that I follow, where I've learned so much because they post multiple times a day, is a site which is called Cruise Industry News. Cruise Industry News gives you multiple updates and really, really on top of everything that's happening. They are a great source of information. In fact, if you're only going to follow one thing on Facebook, that's the one page I would actually follow. You can also follow, of course, CLEAR, the Cruise Line Association. They have CLEAR Global page and they also have CLEAR Europe page. They do tend to update, but they're probably not as active in terms of updating and ongoing information and all the nuances as the Cruise Industry News would do. Another fantastic resource is if you are into podcasts, I would strongly recommend Doug Parker's Cruise Radio News. Doug has run his podcast for many, many years. He has two key podcasts. The News, which is a daily update, so every single day of the week. It's a really short couple of minutes with all the latest news from the last 24 hours. And then he has another podcast where he also talks about the news in more depth and does cruise line reviews. So those are the kind of social media related things that are really, really topical and up to date. And the advantage they have, as I say, on a YouTube channel is they are doing it hour by hour. As news comes out, they're posting it. Another great resource is Cruise Critic. On Cruise Critic, they have a page which they constantly update, which gives you alphabetically, line by line, for both ocean and river. They will tell you when the cruise line's currently scheduled to open cruising again, and also they will include details on what their current refunds and cancellation policies are. So that's another great resource, and they constantly update that as cruise lines change. And that's going to happen over the coming weeks and months. I think we're going to see lots of chops and changes on that. The next thing I would spend some time thinking about is whether you're going to do your future cruise bookings through a cruise travel agent or with a cruise line direct. Now, historically, I've always recommended using a cruise agent, particularly if you're new to cruise, because they can help curate, they can help talk you through the different options, make sure you get on the right cruise line, on the right itinerary, in the right cabin. However, during the shutdown, there are some limitations to that. So certainly in some countries where there was a complete shutdown and shops and offices had to close, in many cases it was quite difficult for agents to keep operating. So it actually became quite frustrating for many people. I've had lots of people contact me saying, actually, the fact they booked through an agent has become problematic and difficult in terms of getting refunds, getting things changed, getting latest information because of the shutdown. So what you need to think about is it better and easier for you to work direct with the cruise line? Certainly what we've seen recently, for many people, going through the cruise line has been a little bit easier. If they've booked their flight, their transfers, their hotels, and the cruise, they've had one cancellation and they've found they've got refunded on things like airlines, hotels, and that really quickly, and they've got future cruise credit, or they've got the option to take cash depending on the cruise line. So think about moving forwards. Do you want to work directly with the cruise line or with an agent? There are lots of benefits of working longer term with an agent because they often get better deals, they can often get you better cabins, and they might have to throw in different things. But you may want to, because everything has happened, take a more cautious approach, and perhaps if you're really, really clear on the cruise line that you want to go with, is working and bundling everything together. And that, the advantage of that is also, as I discovered, because I've tended to mix and match. Sometimes I've used agents, sometimes I've used the cruise line, and I've sometimes put together packages myself where I booked the airline separately, I booked hotels separately, I booked the cruises separately, and actually the whole cancellation process became quite complicated because those had different cancellation policies and refund options. So definitely spend some time thinking about moving forwards. How do you want to book your cruising travel? The fifth thing I would do is get ready for taking advantage of the great deals. So sign up for all of the cruise lines' email newsletters for those cruise lines that you like or you think you might want to cruise with. What we're starting to see is lots and lots and lots of offers coming through. I mean, even today I got a whole bunch of offers where they're basically offering pretty much all-inclusive fares for a normal fares. So, for example, I got an email today from Holland America, and they were offering your gratuities, your drinks, especially dining, Wi-Fi, all sorts of things were going to be added onto your cruise, and deposits were 50% of what they were. They're really trying to get more people to book. They're trying to get people to commit to cruises, and you can book those right through all of the itineraries into 2021, 2022. That's why I said, even if you want to go cruising much later than in the short term, now is the time to look for deals. Also, what's important is many of them are bundling in their cruising with confidence guarantee, where they're offering you sometimes much more flexibility in terms of moving things, not losing deposits, that kind of stuff. So take a look at that. Sign up for the email newsletters and keep an eye on those. The next thing to think about is if you are a senior traveler, and particularly if you're over 70. At the time of recording, what was put in place, and I don't think this is going to go away for a long time, was a requirement to have a medical certificate if you're over 70 before you went on a cruise. Now, once cruising starts up again, that may be relaxed, but I don't think that's going to happen personally for quite some time, or certainly until there's a vaccine or some kind of procedure like that in place. So if you're a senior traveler, one of the things you do have to think about is just how far ahead you want to think about cruising. What's going to be key is your governments and regulatory authorities changing their rulings on when they're advising people over 70 to go traveling. That's very important, because if you are over 70, you may struggle to get travel insurance to go cruising. Now, there are some exceptions to that. If you're in the UK, you have some advantage because Saga, which focus on the 50 plus, they bundle their insurance into their cruise fare. And I think it's going to be really interesting as an aside, whether moving forwards we see more and more cruise lines bundling insurance in. That actually leads me onto my next point, travel insurance. One of the things I always recommend really strongly is make sure that you have travel insurance before you go on a cruise. What you will find is both current and new policies will not cover anything to do with pandemics or anything related to what's going on now or similar kind of breakouts, God forbid if they happen. But what they are absolutely important for is if you have other things, so you might have some medical emergency on the ship, or you might need medical treatment or repatriation or evacuation or whatever. Those costs are enormous and travel insurance will still cover those. But really, really important is to think about when you are going to be able to get travel insurance. What I would actually suggest, which is what I do, is I have an annual policy, because actually it works out in the end about the same or cheaper if I'm trying to buy multiple policies. So what I've done, actually, my policy was due to expire. I've actually renewed that for another year and made sure it's got built-in cruise cover. That's really important. Check that your travel insurance includes cruise cover. But make sure you've got travel insurance in place, because then if you do bookings and you have to cancel them for non-pandemic related issues, you do have recourse with your travel insurance. So basically at the time of booking, make sure you've got travel insurance in place. And then of course, once you go on your cruise, it's going to protect you if you do have other medical issues or lost luggage, stolen luggage, or whatever. I would strongly recommend not booking cruises unless you know you can get travel insurance. It's really, really important, even though it's not going to cover you for pandemics. The next thing I would suggest you spend some time thinking about as you're planning cruises, particularly if you want to go cruising sooner rather than later. I would actually recommend you focus closer to home. What we saw in the whole run-up to the shutdown is people who had gone on these very exotic long-distance cruises actually had some quite stressful times if there was quarantine, or even if there wasn't quarantining, getting home and just being really, really far away from home. One of the things I would therefore recommend is focus close to home, so you don't have to worry about the whole problems of long-haul flights or long-distance flights, because we don't know when they're going to start up and reconnect and be flowing smoothly, what the itineraries for those are going to be. So try and focus local. I think you'll find it much less stressful in the short term and probably much easier, because you also will know much more around what's going on in your regional country. Another key thing that I've spent some time focusing on, I think is really, really important, is as you think about going cruising again, if you have either moved cruises or had cruises cancelled and you've taken the future cruise option, is you need to understand how that's going to work, because each of the cruise lines has different ways of doing it. So for example, I've had a Cunard cruise and a Virgin cruise at this point in time cancelled. Both of those issued future cruise, or took the future cruise credit option. And both of those, they don't send you any documentation from that. It's held with them in your account. In fact, what they do is it's linked to original booking reference. So actually when you want to trigger that, you kind of have to contact them and book that way to then be able to use your future cruise credit. On those future cruise credits, you can spread it across a number of different cruises, for example. However, on other cruises, on Royal Caribbean, for example, what I've seen them do is they are issuing more sort of certificates, if you like, email certificates. So that those are used in a different way. So making sure that you really understand, if you've had a cruise cancelled and you have a future cruise credit, how it works and how you're going to be able to trigger it. So in many cases, what is kind of frustrating is in a lot of cases, you're going to have to phone the call center, which of course is crazy busy with cancellations, and try and book cruises to apply future cruise credits. So spend some time clarifying and making sure you understand when you get your future cruise credit details, how you can actually use it. I hope that has helped you. I have lots more videos, of course, of cruising tips once you start thinking of going cruising again. And so why don't you watch another one of those right now?